You are listening to the AOTA Podcast. Here is your host, Matt Brandenburg.
All right, welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by two very special guests, Kalyn Briggs and Tim Dionne. You both emphasize rural healthcare in your research, and I'd love to highlight your experience and ask what other OT practitioners can learn from your expertise and some of what you've been doing over the past couple years. To start off, could you please introduce us to your experience working in rural healthcare as an occupational therapy professional?
Sure. So my name's Kalyn, and I have been in OT for over 22 years, and I've worked rural across the course of my entire career, everywhere from Idaho to Eastern Washington to Texas, and I'm currently in Montana. And Montana's not even classified as rural; we're classified as frontier, and so rural has been a natural kind of underpinning in my life. I was raised in a very rural community, so I have a passion to serve people from rural areas, and it's an important part of my practice. Right now, I'm working in a rural telehealth job, and I'm supervising an occupational therapy assistant who works in a critical care access hospital 100 miles away from here.
Wow. And how about you, Tim?
Well, I've only been in Albuquerque for about coming up on 6 years. And prior to that, my clinical experience has been kind of the opposite, rural urban environments. So I worked at now Shirley Ryan Ability Lab in Chicago. Then it was called RIC. And so coming to Albuquerque was kind of a stark contrast for me. I do work clinically on weekends as needed at different regional hospitals in town. But I primarily teach at the University of New Mexico, which is the only OT program in our state. I have found that the unique challenges are definitely unique, and I've learned a lot and put a lot of effort into training our students for those challenges.
I love that. I love that. Thank you both for being on the show today. I'm excited to learn all about rural healthcare and OT's role in rural healthcare. I've never been to Montana and I've never been to Albuquerque, so I think I need to already expound my exposure to these frontier areas. Kalyn and Tim, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that OT practitioners face in rural areas?
My primary occupation is I'm an academic. I'm a teacher, and so I've been doing that for over a decade. And so kind of, talking about what Tim talked about is preparing our students and our future workforce to work in rural areas. And I've done a lot of reading and research about what it takes to do that. And a lot of it has to start with the education they receive, which I'm sure Tim could speak to too, is like building a curriculum to be able to support student success in rural areas. And what does that look like? It's still kind of an emerging area that we're trying to infuse into our academic programs. But, back to the question though, biggest challenges, is lack of resources. And so, it's so much different than urban and suburban areas because it's not like you can, drive down the street to get some durable medical equipment. You have to, leverage community supports, wait for shipping and other equipment to be able to to arrive. And sometimes you have a hard time accessing caregivers and caregiver support because family members and things leave the area. And so it just depends on your access to resources. And I think those are big challenges. And then it takes a lot of time to practice in rural areas because you spend a lot of time. I call it windshield time. I've done home health in rural areas. And so you spend a lot of time in your car processing and reflecting, but it takes a lot of time to cover a lot of area in rural areas. And so you might just not feel like your practice is being as effective because you have to drive and it takes time.
Those were almost exactly all the points I wrote down in prep of this question. The geographic distance of New Mexico is so fascinating to me because it's the fifth largest state landmass wise, but our, population is only, 2 million. And so there's a lot of driving time for therapists. There's a lot of like large caseloads. And I know some therapists who do home health and, do one county, or, a handful of counties, certain days of the week, and then another set other days of the week. And so it's tough, to attract, therapists to work in regions that they're maybe not familiar with. So those staffing resources is a big challenge. And then just the community infrastructure after discharge, like the process of it, a lot of works here in Albuquerque is, Albuquerque is the center of the healthcare for the state, and people go home from there, 2, 3, 5 hours away. And so, if they're on oxygen or if they need any kind of durable medical equipment, how are they going to get it? I once overheard a case manager explaining to a DME company that their patient didn't have an address. It was just directions. And so they had to literally call the UPS office and give them verbal directions of how to get to this location. And it was like, turn left at this rock, and less than ideal information to get, a delivery of a device. And this also includes, Native American land and different communities. And so it's a challenge to get to these places. And so let alone services. And so that, going from people who want to return home when they need services, and the closest skilled nursing facility where they most thrive is hours from their family. These are the kind of realities that our patients are facing, and so the therapists have to expertly handle and navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it seems like the service delivery has those kind of logistical challenges and timing challenges that are unique to practice in this specialty. How does the limited OTR to OTA ratio in rural communities impact service delivery and patient outcomes?
I think there's a shortage collectively right now of OTs and OTRs and OTAs. I know the market's pretty hot, but I think the challenge in regards to rural communities is that there's just not enough of us to do the work. So like speaking from personal experience, like I told you, I'm providing like evaluative telehealth services and remote supervisory access and support to an occupational therapy assistant who just happens to live in a rural area. And she had been out there for over 2 years not working as an OTA because she didn't have a licensed OTR to supervise her. And so coming up with like unique ways to be able to get the provision of services in rural areas as appropriate, because telehealth is not necessarily the most accurate platform to be able to provide services, but like that's just one of the issues that I think I'm illuminating. Like if you had an OTA or an OTR in all of the small areas that cover different counties and different states, then, service delivery, there wouldn't be any gaps in service delivery, but that's the biggest dilemma, is that there's just not enough of us in those areas. And then kind of like Tim and I have been, like we said, like the windshield time. So on average, if you are doing like traditional home health, depending on how big the county is and how big the area is that you're traveling, you can maybe only see 3 to 5 patients a day. And so just the workforce shortage impacts how much services we can get to the patients in the areas in which they live.
Yeah, it's been limiting in New Mexico too. In the same way, we've gotten reports. The state association, like at our conference every year, there's always folks saying, we need more supervising OTRs in this region. We have a lot of OTAs, but they can't practice. It's disheartening to hear that because we have people in the community and that's what we want, but we need more. And I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to address is getting fieldwork placements in these communities and using alternative fieldwork supervisors that maybe aren't OTRs to try to expose our students to these communities so that maybe they would be enticed to work in such a community. It's been somewhat fruitful, but mostly the folks who plan to work in these regions grew up and live in these regions, which has been nice that we've been able to recruit folks from those areas. It tends to be people from the community who go back to the community, who work there.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like there's some, opportunities for innovation and collaboration there to kind of combat some of this workforce shortage. And I do find it interesting that many practitioners that practice in rural settings grew up and are from rural settings themselves. What role would you say cultural awareness plays in providing effective services in a rural setting?
Ooh, I love that question. I think it plays a huge role. You have to understand how to navigate like the community-based resources and aspects. It's really strong in places like Montana, depending on the region, like, I hate to say it, like outsiders, right? So like if you're not from there and you don't really understand how people get along and what their day-to-day occupations and roles and habits and routines look like, then you're not going to be as an effective practitioner, because you really don't understand the cultural aspects to their lifestyle. And so it's a huge, important part to understanding how we provide services in these areas. So that's a great question. Cultural awareness is huge, like rural cultural humility. I like that terminology too. It's important to try to understand what that feels like in the places with the populations of people you serve in rural areas.
Yeah, definitely. I'll echo that. As someone who came here from, I did my education in New York and my clinical practice in Chicago. I practice a lot of cultural humility, and I do find myself, as time goes on, more familiar and comfortable with different unique aspects that I didn't even think, were a thing I was even aware of before. And so I think one of the things that our program, and I imagine both of our programs do, is involve a lot of cultural education in like case studies, and we do problem-based learning. So we have these cases where the patient is from a rural community and these are the challenges that they're facing, or they're a farmer and we're involved in the agribility project, and so we have a lot of background information with that, and so the students get more comfortable with asking lots of questions and being curious and being comfortable with that uncertainty of a community that they may not know of. Yeah, it's really important both in practice and education.
I love that. I think it's an integral part of OT care and person-centered service delivery across settings, but maybe even more so in a rural community where there is a strong sense of community, and you want to show people that you respect that and you love it, and we're trying to help them, optimize their performance of whatever occupation or task is giving them the most meaning. I want to ask about some of the specific barriers that people with spinal cord injury may face in rural acute and rehabilitation settings. Could you discuss some of those?
Yeah, I can, Kalyn. I don't know if you would like to also, but I recently did a focus group study, and it's one I'm presenting at the Inspire conference this year. Basically, we did an interdisciplinary focus group with both PTs and OTs who work in acute and rehab settings. And we asked them kind of what challenges they've been facing. And so, in many cases, we found that just due to the specific population characteristics, so, it's traumatic in nature, the rate of an SCI population isn't necessarily predictable. So what happens, at least in our hospital systems, is there's one or two here, or, it's so infrequent and inconsistent that staff don't necessarily know about the challenges. And then the therapists may have some familiarity and expertise, and then seek that out before working with them. But then working in the hospital with the other staff, it's a challenge. There may be staff turnover. So there's this like vacuum of knowledge. There may be traveling nurses or nurses who've not worked with this population, and so they may not know that things like bowel program needs to be done around the same time every day. They may not know that they have to turn and to avoid pressure sores, or they may know and it may be a challenge to get to because of staffing issues. And so there's this kind of really broad problem facing this population, particularly here in Albuquerque, because they're finding that most of them have frequent readmissions with skin breakdown that were required at the setting they were in, whether that's an acute setting or a rehab setting. They're also spending, because of the unique discharge challenges of people in our state, they're spending a lot of time in an acute setting instead of a rehab setting because they acquire a sore, and then they end up doing a lot of their air quotes rehab in the hospital instead of a rehab specific facility. And so, it causes a lot of stress and anxiety in the therapists. And so one of the things that that kind of came out of this was the recommendation of training and what types of training would be most effective in terms of like taking courses, but then also having hands-on personal experience with this population, and then kind of identifying practice leaders in different groups and making sure those practice leaders, there's a plan in place to hand that title off to someone if they move on to another hospital. But then just getting the team involved in going through. One of the things that happened really recently here at UNM that they're very excited about is that we have a new attending PM&R physician who focuses on spinal cord injury. And so he essentially works at all of the hospitals following all of the cases. And so we've actually gotten a lot better outcomes because of this consistent care here in Albuquerque. And so it's a big challenge. And that's just being in the hospital and doing rehab. That's not wheelchair seating, mobility. That's not, we're not even talking about getting home. We're just talking about making it through the hospital stay and making it to rehab.
Yeah. I think I can't speak to Tim's extensive research with spinal cord injury, and I don't have much of any professional experience with spinal cord injury, but like based on some of the courses that I've taught across my career, like assistive technology and wheelchair seating and positioning, like Tim said. So learning who your vendors are and if they can access rural areas to help clients who've sustained spinal cord injuries. I know like one of the ATP professionals here in Billings, where I'm located, they have several different hubs where they're based out of, but they drive the entire state and they make routes and they're scheduled out pretty far in advance, like annually and stuff. But like being able to get to the rural areas to service power wheelchairs and the equipment they need. And like, then when we're speaking about Montana and then probably New Mexico too, at Tim, like agriculture is a huge industry. And so let's say it's a farmer or rancher or somebody who's a blue collar employee that hurt themselves, sustain a spinal cord injury and want to get back to work, and they have specialized equipment that needs to be serviced that provides a challenge to being able to get to them to service the equipment. So those are some barriers that I've like heard of through other professionals that I've worked with in my academic career. So it's a huge challenge to not only individuals with spinal cord injuries, but like anybody in rural areas getting access to services.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of unique barriers that maybe some OT students or practitioners aren't familiar with or don't have experience in addressing. What are the implications of health resources and service administration, or HRSA, funding for OT students from disadvantaged backgrounds? And where does that tie into kind of some of these challenges that come with practicing in a rural healthcare setting?
Well, that's one of the projects that I've been working on. So it's a grant funded through HRSA, and it's called the Scholarships for Disadvantaged Students, which I'm not the hugest fan of their name, but what it did, and it ends this fiscal year. So we've had it for 5 years, and we reapplied, and we'll see how that goes. But it was $650,000 in scholarships for every year. So a little over $3 million in scholarship funding with no strings attached. And our goal with that funding was to provide relief from student loans and increase providers working in rural communities and potentially appeal to OTAs who may be really interested in becoming an OTR and getting their master's degree, which is our entry level at our program. But just due to the time commitment and the money specifically, it'd be a challenge. So we've been focused on recruiting people from the community. And, I think we've made a lot of inroads providing that money to students, over 70 OT students over the 5 years, and including a handful of OTAs. And all of them were from diverse backgrounds and rural backgrounds. And I think the biggest challenge still that we're facing with appealing to students to come to our program with this funding is really just getting to the communities and teaching to the community, to the students who may be interested in this, what OT is. So we've done a handful of local high school, regional high school, rural high school presentations in different communities, Santa Fe, Cuba, Taos. And so just to kind of expose students to different fields with the hopes that one day they'd be interested in applying to our program. And so, it seems like a lot, and it's been a really quick 5 years working on this project, but I hope we get it again because it was a huge benefit to our students. And I'm proud to say that we were able to provide all that funding for them.
Yeah, that's a wonderful program. It sounds like you both have been a part of many efforts related to education, training, capacity, and advocacy to build awareness and build effectiveness in providing OT services in a rural setting. Why is it so important to address these unique challenges that come with rural OT practice?
That's a great question. I think, but our aging population is growing exponentially, and a lot of these individuals live in rural areas. And so it's really important, based on the statistics of just how our population is growing and what's happening, is to understand how we meet their needs, because I think we all understand as occupational therapists how important place is and context and environment is on our health and well-being. And so trying to meet people where they're at is a huge important factor to the success that we have as practitioners. And so being able to work with clients in environments and communities that they're familiar with people and supports around them that they're familiar with in their homes, is the most powerful place that we can have therapy, essentially. And so relocation, though it might be necessary in certain situations, is not the most advantageous. So that's the risk that we face with not meeting their needs in the rural communities in which they live.
And what would you say would be maybe some of the risks of not addressing these challenges appropriately for patients and OT professionals alike?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think funding. So living in a skilled nursing facility or an assisted living facility is cost prohibitive, and those locations are not usually in rural communities where the people usually reside where they're from. And so their ability to age gracefully, and I know I'm speaking about the older population because that's my experiences with them. And so I think you just risk them being safe and not being able to perform occupations that they need to be able to live a well life. And it costs a lot of money to not live at home. And depending what their benefits are with Medicare and Medicaid, it's hard to try to get coverage. So that adds an additional stressor or challenge for these patients.
The resources and, maybe as simple as family member who could come in, they could discharge home, but a family member needs to be with them for a week or two, and their closest family member is not able to get there, hours away drive, or they're working themselves. And, it may make more sense on paper to send someone to a skilled nursing facility for, a subacute rehab stay for a couple weeks until they're independent, but that may just not be possible. What if a person decides that they can handle it at home, and then they have an incident that, puts their safety at risk, and they may need to get readmitted to the hospital. And so there's a lot of these kind of ethical questions and challenges that the practitioners face when just kind of deciding discharge location.
Yeah, that's a unique challenge. What strategies have you both found to be effective in kind of approaching these rural OT challenges and, throughout the OT process?
Just really getting to know the communities, really getting to know the clients we're serving, understanding that you're not going to be the expert in their life. Like, I wouldn't know the first thing about farming and ranching, but if that is what their occupation of choice is, then being able to hear them, complete the occupational profile and any other assessments, and then make sound, client informed decisions on their plan of care, I think is an important part of it, because the rural lifestyle is not familiar to everybody. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that even an entry level or a seasoned practitioner needs to understand, is that they're the expert in their lives, and they've usually formulated some kind of a solution to be able to allow them to do things that they need to do. And you can learn a lot from that. And so I think that those are just a couple strategies that maybe I've put in place. And then, of course, kind of tying back to the cultural awareness, and just being cognizant that it's a different cultural environment, rural areas and communities, and just being really attuned to that is an important factor I think clinicians need to understand.
On the other side, too, on the therapist side, I think the biggest thing that I've seen to be effective in supporting OTs in these communities to help their patients is building a community, and understanding the resources, and sharing with other therapists, and so that expertise. So, an example of a spinal cord injury, if that's your background, becoming that leader and standing up and saying, hey, I have this expertise, let me help you if you face this in your community. And so there are a couple platforms that can be done in, and so I think developing your resources and as an OT and even, as a new OT going into a community like this, it would be really helpful to identify those resources, get comfortable looking for mentors who may not live near you, but who you can, with the internet, can connect with, and build that community of practice.
Absolutely. And Kalyn's a wonderful example of that with her remote supervision via telehealth. And I know there's a rural health community of practice as well. How have you seen involvement in that help practitioners?
Gosh, it's been, I think this September, we're coming on 2 years for our rural community of practice. And it's really been interesting. So we've had 2 kind of groups or cohorts, so to speak, form. So we've got academicians who are either administrators or teachers in OT programs that are trying to understand and build and infuse more content-rich curriculum that's based on rural practice. And so they attend our COP and give me ideas on speakers and topics that they would like to learn more about. And then the other side is, of course, our practitioners who work in rural areas. And so the COP really serves both of those groups. And we try to find speakers and resources that can help them with their practice, but also help grow the rural workforce and resources at the academic and educational level to be able to help students understand how powerful and rich of a life, as a practitioner that could be as serving people in rural areas. And so it's just been it's a cool little group. We get together and once a month and we talk about all things rural. So it's kind of fun.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
We'll invite listeners to check out that community of practice, and I'll make sure it's linked in our episode description with other resources that you shared with me to be able to review in preparation for this interview. One of which is from the American Psychological Association, highlighting the importance of building trust with rural communities to improve health outcomes, which has been an emerging theme of our conversation, I'm noticing. How have each of you approached building rapport and trust with patients and with communities in rural areas?
One of the things we have done, like I mentioned, going into communities and presenting to high school students about different careers, including OT. But then on top of that, we've also partnered with different groups on campus that represent different rural communities. So we have the Native American health group that we've essentially kind of have been mentored by in developing the language and the approaches to presenting in these communities about OT and accessing offering the opportunity to learn about OT to different communities. And so with moderate success, and it's definitely more successful when the students in your group that you take with you are from the community. That's what we've done, is particularly with the Navajo community and the different Puebloan communities in New Mexico. That's how we've gone about building trust in our diverse state.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think building trust, just honestly, I think OTs are really good at that. We teach and I think we practice therapeutic use of self better than most healthcare professionals. I mean, it's integral to our practice. And so just understanding somebody's story and just being a really good active listener is an important part to every clinical practice, but I think we're really good at it as OTs. I'm biased, of course, but I think just understanding their story and not trying to be like super solution oriented and, diminishing the power differential that sometimes exists with patients and clinicians, and just getting to know who they are as a person, I think is an important aspect. Tim kind of highlighted too the important things that he does when they're going out to high schools, that he takes individuals with him that are from the area. I found across the course of my career that if I tell somebody, so like when I'm doing, for example, when I'm doing a telehealth session, I'm sitting here in my home office. I know where the town is. I've driven through it probably 1,000 times in my life. And so when I can tell somebody that I'm familiar with where you're from because I'm from here, and it kind of changes their perspective on who you are, because they understand that you're familiar with the geographic area and some of the, clinical or the cultural differences that occur there. So that's an important part, I think, that helps build rapport with clients, is that if you have a general understanding of the area of the world that they're from. So those are just a couple things that I've done, and I've kind of taught students how to do to build rapport and trust with clients.
I love that. It really emphasizes the importance of connection. And I believe there's so much power in connecting with someone on an individual basis, or connecting with a community to work together and collaborate to achieve, improved health outcomes and services. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have a health strategy that emphasizes the need for tailored training programs to address rural workforce shortages. And Tim, thank you for already explaining a couple of the initiatives that University of New Mexico is implementing to address that workforce shortage. What have you seen included in those initiatives that has helped or what specific aspects have you seen included in those initiatives that helps OTs and OTAs prepare for rural practice?
This is a tough one. It's a great question, but it's a tough one to answer because it's hard to see the impact of things like the day-to-day training and curriculum development that we've done at UNM to help prepare for practice because we're so close to it. So this would be, I think, maybe a great answered really well by some former students who've been practicing for a while. But I think that we sort of infuse that cultural curiosity we've talked about throughout the practice or throughout the curriculum. We also infuse this understanding of getting the therapeutic use of self, getting to know your client and your patient at this very personal cultural level to develop that rapport. And so as our primary interpersonal skills that every faculty member teaches at the different courses. So again, it's hard to answer that specifically because we're so close to it. But I think that we try to specifically train for it and provide opportunities, fieldwork experiences, partner with different groups in town. We have a local nonprofit that supports adults with disabilities in a farming environment, and so that's a really great OT student experience where they get to go to the farm. It's called Mandy's Farm, and provide support and in different capacities. I spent a couple weeks in the summer building a small garden for food crops as their like sample garden, and so it's an interesting experience for sure. So things like that, experiences like that, really help prepare the students for that rural practice.
Yeah.
I love that. Beautiful to emphasize, the value of those hands-on experiences. And Kalyn, what would you add on to that?
I think Tim's exactly right. It's so hard. The initiatives are there and they want tailored training programs, but it's so broad to be able to cover, rural, because rural in New Mexico is different than rural in Montana. It's different than rural in North Carolina. And so on some level, I think all of us as educators are infusing all of these amazing opportunities, like Tim said, like fieldwork experiences, level 1, level 2, entry-level capstones, like the doctoral capstone experiences, and expanding into like emerging areas of practice. And then I think like being intentional about the evidence, right? So like ensuring that students are reviewing, peer-reviewed articles and evidence-based practice on the provision of services in rural areas. But in regards to like the training initiatives, it's hard. I would love to like write a book or like clinical guidelines or something along those lines, but I feel like it'd be really hard to do that because it's such a broad topic, rural.
That's an interesting point and opens the door for maybe some future, research opportunities. Potentially, if you're listening and want to collaborate with the rural community of practice and contribute to maybe some practice guidelines or some materials, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
How would you recommend clinicians could enhance their practice skills and expertise despite maybe having limited access to mentorship and resources within their rural practice setting?
I think that this question, it kind of delves into some of the subtext, I think, and this is kind of the subtext I found in our study that we did with the practitioners in town, that there a lot of folks feel. A lot of therapists feel not as confident as they potentially should be with their own expertise. And so I think it makes it doubly hard when you're in a community or you're driving a lot and maybe you're one of two or one the OT in the area, and so I think that makes it so isolating and hard. And so to overcome that feeling and sense of isolation and the disruption of self-confidence, where they should have all the confidence in the world because they're the experts. And I know it's a challenge in general, but so overcoming that barrier and isolation, I think, is key. So that's where you connect with your local community, your regional community, your state community, your national community. I think OTs do a really great job at supporting each other and our patients. But so reaching out to other OTs, I think, is the first thing I would do to enhance your practice skills and expertise, because you've got them. And I think sharing that expertise for your region with someone else who has a similar region or slightly different, and then learning from each other, I think that would be highly valuable. And I mean, essential for care. I imagine I would get burned out if I was the only OT in a community and I was expected myself to do all of these things. And I would need that support to function effectively.
Just trusting yourself and knowing that you have the practice skills. And I think something that I learned along the way across the course of my career to this point is that sometimes you're just happy to have help, or somebody to just have an ear to listen to them, even if you can't do everything that you need to be able to do for them. And so just not getting discouraged by that, because that can also be a huge part to rural practice, or any practice, is not getting discouraged. But like Tim said, I think like a rural COP, but then maybe it's something that Tim and I kick off in the future, or something like developing a mentorship program for entry-level OTs and OTAs, that you pair them with a seasoned OT that's been doing rural practice. So
that's a great idea.
These are the kind of conversations, that those ideas get fostered. So maybe there's a space for that. Yeah,
definitely. I think that would be a fantastic program.
I love it. Let's make it happen. How have you seen telehealth expand access to occupational therapy services in rural areas? And how would you recommend a practitioner get started with maybe including and offering telehealth services in their day-to-day?
That's a great question. I think so the OT and I that work together, we expanded telehealth to the critical care access hospital, and we just kind of figured it out as we went along, understanding that I had done a lot of research and understand telehealth and the provision of telehealth services, like from an academic level. So being able to do that with the OTA at the rural hospital has really kind of like put the concepts into practice. And so I think basically would be just starting off with, meeting with hospital administration in the area that you feel like could really use some expanded OT services, and then going from there in regards to what practice setting they think it would be most applicable. Home health, acute care, like I speak from adult practice experience, but I think it all has to depend on the administrative support that the hospital system or the agency would be willing to offer. And then I think another issue that I was going to bring up earlier too, in like rural and frontier areas, is broadband and connectivity issues. And so, in Montana, it's a problem. I could drive like 3 hours north of here and not have any internet connection. And that would be a problem in being able to expand telehealth services. So those are all things that I think an OT who would want to do telehealth in a rural area would have to consider for sure.
Absolutely. Tim, do you have additional insights or recommendations related to telehealth?
My experience with telehealth has been mostly with research, and particularly I'm part of a project where we conducted our intervention through telehealth with local people and so to kind of add that layer of effectiveness in our testing of the intervention to see, for appropriateness and all these other things. So beyond just that, I don't have much professional OT practice in telehealth, but from what I've heard from the community is that it's been a big benefit for certain therapists and certain practices, albeit with challenges.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you both for kind of those recommendations related to telehealth. And again, sounds like another area that could use more attention, more research, more innovation in identifying some potential solutions that could help increase accessibility and the impact that occupational therapy can make in some communities. I want to thank you both for really highlighting the value of community-based training and education for strengthening the rural healthcare workforce already in this interview. What role do community partnerships play in supporting OT practice and improving patient outcomes?
I think it's everything, because you just don't have access to resources like you would in an urban and suburban area. So you have to leverage people in the community and, their ability to be able to help meet clients' needs. I guess like the stories or the case studies that I always tell students, like from personal experience, is like, if they need, like if a farmer needs some kind of piece of equipment modified and you're not a welder, or, you don't possess those skills, somebody in the community might. And so, I'm hesitant to so Carla Wilhite is, she attends our rural community practice, and she teaches in a rural college in Colorado, I believe still. And she coined the term coalition of the willing. And I love that term, and she should probably patent it, because I feel like that's a really accurate classification of how important communities are in regards to patient outcomes and providing support.
I love it. That's a great phrase, coalition of the willing.
Yes.
What recommendations would you give for, how to identify an appropriate community partner, or how to approach or initiate a conversation about a potential partnership? What would you recommend to practitioners?
You have to embrace your extrovert. I think that would be a piece of advice. Like, if your client will likely have a name or a resource or somebody that that they would say they would recommend to help with a certain issue that you might be facing with the client. And so you just have to be willing to pick up the phone or drive down the road and identify if that person can actually assist. And so, just not being shy, making sure that you're doing due diligence in regards to reaching out to individuals, explaining who you are, what it is that you do, like the elevator speech that we teach our students that we have to practice across the course of our career. I think that's an important part to being able to navigate those community relationships and help people understand what it is you're doing and why you're doing it.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you, Kalyn. Tim, was there anything you wanted to add there?
It's been my experience is finding the people and kind of the people willing and growing that list of support and getting out there and reaching out to different different community groups.
What funding resources are available for rural practitioners, and how can they successfully apply and obtain any funding support?
The only thing that comes to mind is we have had a couple state legislative bills passed that provide some tax breaks to rural clinicians, not necessarily student loan like repayment stuff, and that's separate. But this is there's been some legislation focused on healthcare practitioners as a whole in New Mexico to promote, rural healthcare. And so, as a OT faculty, and involved in, or trying to be involved in the legislative process, I've emailed and contacted the lawmakers in support of this kind of legislation. But I don't necessarily know of anything specific beyond that for financial resources for practitioners. We have for patients, we have a couple different resources that are available to anyone in the state that are like DME lending closets, and I believe it's called Back in Use. And so folks with, unused, no longer need, or, never been taken out of the packaging equipment, that can be donated to someone who would need it, who may not have the resources for it. Those are the only two things that come to mind, to be honest.
Well, that kind of triggered my memory. I'm glad that Tim. So, like the state AT agencies, so like our state AT agency has funds for assistive technology, and they have grant programs. Like Tim talked at depth about the HRSA program, the grant program. I think I know of like some other like smaller level grants for like through like the Rural Hub, but I don't know how large they are. I think I've had some speakers from the Rural COP talk about different funding opportunities, but then like Tim said, I'll just piggyback like state advocacy with legislation, and especially in Montana. So they have a little bit more funding, for rural initiatives because of the nature of our state, but I don't know how that trickles down to like OTs per se.
It sounds like some of these funding resources can be difficult to locate and apply for or understand, may require some more advocacy efforts and background research. What about practice resources? What additional practice supports or clinical supports would you recommend to our listeners?
I think just any research on rural is important. So, and I should have wrote down all the names of the rural journals that I really like to frequent. Of course, senior moment, I can't remember them all right now, but like the Rural Hub is one that I go to frequently. The University of Washington also has some really amazing rural resources. I did a search last week for the Inspire sessions coming up for conference. There's like over 20 posters. There's a couple short sessions. So it's been gaining a lot of exposure in OT for a long time. I think there's a lot of resources in Australia. I think that Tim, don't they usually come in about second when it comes to like rural first or second? There's a lot of resources out of Australia.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's been my experience.
Yeah. And so just looking there, those would be some of my suggestions or ideas, I guess.
I think if you are a rural practitioner, building, what we've mentioned, building that community, but then also reaching out to the local university or the closest OT program, wherever that may be, and seeing if you could host a fieldwork student. That's probably one of the biggest benefits to the practice as a rural practitioner as a resource, because not only will you have a student that you can train, and that may be a bit of a drain on your resources, but in the end, I think it will only benefit you and them and your community by exposing new potential practitioners to your region, but then also having them take that experience back to their university and share with their classmates or cohort. There's a lot of experiences like that could be really beneficial.
Thank you both for those recommendations. What final piece of advice would you give to OT professionals or students who are considering working in rural healthcare?
I think it's super rewarding, and it doesn't necessarily regardless of where your practice is, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural, the likelihood that you're probably going to work with a client who's returning to a rural area or is from a rural area or has a passion to be in a rural area is pretty high. So understanding that rural practice really just kind of infuses into a lot of different aspects of us being OTs. And it's super rewarding. Like I said, it's just being able to help somebody and make those community connections. And once you're a part of the community, they just love you. I don't know. You just always feel warm welcomes from these communities of people because they see your value and they understand what you're bringing to people that matter to them. So I think that would be the advice I would give.
Yeah, and my advice is, come with it with an open mind in terms of new experiences and new things. Like I've mentioned, my background hasn't always been rural, and I would argue that living in Albuquerque makes it still not rural, but I'm close enough to the rural communities that that expanded a lot of things, learned new hobbies, met new people, had really great experiences in places and ways that I never thought I would. So approaching it with an open mind and just, curiosity, and it'll only serve you well.
I love that. Thank you both so much again for your time, for sharing your expertise and information. This has been really informative for myself, and I'm sure for our listeners as well. So just thank you for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the AOTA podcast. Tune in again next time.